Hi, my name is Reid. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California. And today I'd like to talk about OCD symptoms, obsessive-compulsive disorder symptoms, during and after narcissistic abuse. So just to quickly kind of recapitulate what narcissistic abuse is and can be, in it, typically the survivor finds themselves feeling dependent and often very well being dependent when it's a child who is surviving it on someone who is narcissistic. And the person who's narcissistic tends to carry with them a core sense of worthlessness that they solve by sort of promoting their worth, but through sort of sheer denial, and this is all unconscious, and insisting they're in fact worth a lot more than others, and that's referred to as sort of grandiosity. And in conjunction, they feel entitled for that others reflect back that elevated sense of themselves, and often grow enraged if that artificially boosted reflection of themselves is not reflected back by somebody, particularly the survivor of such abuse, the child or the partner. So in order for a child or a partner to survive this kind of abuse, it becomes necessary to sort of cut off the spontaneity of self-expression, because there's a very sort of narrow range that will, a narrow range of self-expression that will prove sort of palatable to their narcissistic abuser. And when you're in the midst of it, there's not a whole lot of room for error and sort of going outside that range. And in order to maintain that kind of vigilance over oneself and sort of curating expressions of oneself that one knows will stand the best chance of placating the narcissistic abuser, or at least lowering the odds that they will attack or sort of re-injure the survivor by withdrawing their love again in heavy quotes there, in essence hurt the survivor more. And some psychological contortions are necessary to curtail just what would otherwise be as these natural self-expressions. I think someone, I don't recall where I read it, but a safety in relationship was sort of described as kind of the freedom to just spontaneously be and express oneself as it occurs to them, with very little deliberation, and knowledge that whether they're, whatever they're expressing is going to be received in a receptive enough manner. And that's quite the opposite of what the person experiencing narcissistic abuse feels. They're made to feel that any upset on the part of the narcissist is entirely their fault, and that they must sort of, again, contort themselves in order to avoid that dreaded outcome of upsetting the narcissist by their survivor's supposed defects or misbehavior or disrespectful actions to the narcissist. And the need to do these psychological contortions in order to be wary of one's own spontaneous expressions, I think can be a foothold into which OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, can kind of come in and in a way function well in what is for the survivor in terms of what they have to do to survive the abuse at the time, but certainly can also create, necessarily its own level of suffering internally. And today I want to kind of talk about that, explain some of the features of OCD that can happen during and sometimes after narcissistic abuse, with an eye towards just shedding a light on this feature of experience that survivors can sometimes have. And if this is a part of your experience, to maybe offer some context for when and how it's arisen, and also some tactics for how to combat it, or at least pointing towards some resources that can help. So just to define what OCD is, obsessive-compulsive disorder, in essence, it's when we experience a sort of intrusive, disturbing thought that seems to kind of come out of nowhere, and then feel very compelled to do or think something else to neutralize the anxiety that accompanies that intrusive thought. Sort of trope about the OCD is someone who is afraid of finding germs on a doorknob. So they may have to constantly wipe down the doorknob in order to be able to touch it. And so, for instance, someone with that type of fear may be like, oh, if I touch this doorknob, because they're leaving an office, I'm going to catch a terrible disease. And so they might wipe it 10 times. And that neutralizes their anxiety just enough so they can open the door and maybe walk out. Well, then a few steps later, they might get another intrusive thought, which is sort of what's termed the obsession part of OCD, of like, oh, what if you didn't wipe it well enough and you actually contracted malaria or something? Then one may have to go into the bathroom and wash their hands 12 times to neutralize the anxiety about that thought about malaria, and so on and so forth. There's this experience of a surge in anxiety at a distressing, intrusive thought, and then an effort to neutralize that anxiety with something to counteract it. But these are short-term solutions that counteract that initial anxiety-producing thought, and just create this constant cycle that the person with OCD just has to keep sort of going through. And I think it can be important to understand how OCD functions in certain abusive circumstances. And I should caveat this with, this is very much a clinical observation. And the research as of yet, I don't think would sort of state that this is unequivocally true. So, but anyway, I thought that was important. That's an important caveat to today's discussion. So particularly, I think what can happen in narcissistic abuse is that the obsessions or the intrusive, unwanted thought that creates the anxiety and the compulsion, because that's sort of the compulsion is what's the thought or the behavior used to neutralize the anxiety, can often happen just sort of mentally. That it often doesn't involve a whole lot of hand washing and so forth to neutralize the initial anxiety, but it can create a similar system of having an intrusive thought and having to think other thoughts to try to neutralize that distressing thought. So just to kind of I'll give some more examples later on, but I'd like to outline 4 features of obsessive thoughts in this regard that can, I think, be important to understand. And these come from a wonderful book on OCD called Tormenting Thoughts and Secret Rituals, written by Osborn. I'll put it in the description box. The 4 features of an obsession are, to start with, that they are intrusive. They intrude on one's consciousness suddenly and without warning. It can often lead to a sense that one can't control the contents of the thoughts in one's own mind. A very distressing experience. These thoughts are recurrent. For instance, a very common obsession, not common, one of the forms of obsession can take is, say for a new parent, to have these intrusive images of hurting their newborn child. And they're extremely distressing. So let's say a thought comes in, or an image of committing a violent act to that child. And it's nothing that this parent would ever do. It's so against their nature, but it intrudes on them. And they can't do anything to stop them from recurring. That's an important feature of labeling these such thoughts as obsessions. The third feature of an obsession is that they are unwanted. The thoughts are disturbing to the thinker, but again, can't be stopped. And they're often so disturbing in nature that they very much evoke the urge to fight the thought. Like in the example, no, I would never do that to my child. I'm a good parent. And maybe similarly to washing one's hands, that can be the compulsive ritual necessary to try to neutralize that stark anxiety of these horrible images coming into one's mind about doing this thing to their newborn child, again, whom they love dearly. And the fourth feature of an obsession is that they're inappropriate. I mean, they go against the very nature of the thinker, right? So in this example, and this is not a narcissistic parent, this is a good enough parent who very much loves their child, having such an intrusive thought of a violent image of hurting their child, it would understandably evoke a reaction of disgust, fear, terror, because it's so at odds with how they know themselves to be and want to believe that they are, and they are. And it can almost create a sense of am I going crazy? because why am I having such thoughts when that's not at all how I know myself to be? Importantly, for any sufferer of OCD, they're not at all at risk of going crazy, and have a very firm grasp on reality, which is kind of, crazy is not the right term, but I guess wondering about, am I having a psychotic episode where one does or is at risk of losing contact with reality, but not in OCD. So those can be the four important features of noticing obsession when it occurs. And then two, the counteracting, like, no, I'm not this way. I don't think I'm this way. Well, I haven't had this thought in the last like 3 seconds or something. So I must not be, or it may not come again. But of course, these types of obsessive thoughts recur, and the fear that the obsession creates often returns. So if we take, this experience in the context of narcissistic abuse, one of, I think, important thing about OCD is that it creates this theater of the mind, but it's not like watching a comedy. It's like watching, I think, kind of a horror show. When the sufferer is very much has to be wholly occupied with the contents of their mind. And now, people can experience this and still function at quite high levels. It's very, I think, annoying to say the least, and it can be distracting. But it's incredible too how much people can do with sort of this underlying bed of like activity going on in the mind while it's happening. And I think in the context of narcissistic abuse, this sort of horror, I guess, theater of the mind can be very functional, because and I'll talk more about how it does, how so a little bit later, but it very much takes the person's focus into the self, and creates problems that are under one's own umbrella, rather than kind of like the more unsolvable problems between the survivor and the narcissist at the time. And so some of the common, I guess, the contents of obsessive, intrusive thoughts that I've encountered in this work start with body dysmorphic concerns. So a fear of deformity of a certain body part, like a nose is too big, or fear of being overweight, but not an eating disordered way of like binge eating or purging necessarily, but just sort of like, say, looking in the mirror and finding oneself to be in a way that feels, or having an intrusive thought, or that I'm obese, or that I'm too weak, physically weak. Or, for instance, fear of, for either men or women, losing one's hair can be another example. All these things sort of keep one's focus on what are these perceived defects in one's physical appearance that sort of keep the other experience of what's going on between the survivor and the narcissist out of one's focus. And then there's, I think, another category of content of obsessive fears can be identity concerns. So in some cases I've seen, and this is actually written about in the Osborn book, where someone who feels and has known themselves to be heterosexual throughout their lives gets an intrusive thought that is homosexual in nature in some sort, and grows very anxious that maybe they are in fact homosexual instead of heterosexual, and that kind of becomes the content of the obsessive fear. It can be distressing to the thinker, not because there's obviously anything wrong with being homosexual, but more because the thought is so, for the person who is identified, genuinely as heterosexual, how antithetical it is to how they've known themselves is the true sort of distressing part of the obsession. Another identity or type of identity concern could be fear of committing physical violence against someone whom you know yourself to really love. And just like the example earlier with the new good parent who's having these intrusive thoughts about hurting their baby, could be another one. And in any case, those are just a few of the kinds of concerns or obsessive fears that I've at least noticed can occur in the context of narcissistic abuse. It's certainly not an exhaustive list. And hopefully by talking about the features of this type of experience, other forms of this experience might be able to be caught and noticed and regarded as obsessive thoughts rather than things to take at face value. So the functions of OCD in the context of narcissistic abuse. I think first and foremost, when these obsessive thoughts are happening, it makes it very hard, or can make it very hard to get angry, because one is so absorbed and concerned about like the status of their own kind of inner equilibrium, which feels way out of disarray, that it's like, what's the point in getting angry out here in the outside world when I feel like my world inside is falling apart? You know, that's of course very adaptive in narcissistic abuse, because getting angry at the narcissist is sort of sealing one's fate in a bad way if you're if they have authority over you in that moment. Another function of the OCD is managing the fear one may feel in relation to the narcissist. There's a lot of reasons I think that the child or the partner of the narcissist would have reasons to fear him or her. Not only certainly we talked about how they want to maintain the attachment to that person or that parent or that partner, but they also know how much they've been hurt by the narcissist, either by the withdrawal of what they thought before was the love of the narcissist, or this sort of outright acts of abuse and attack and rebuke that the narcissist may have already visited upon them. And so if they're having to stay in relationship to that narcissist, that you sort of live with this looming dread of like, not a matter of when, if, but when that hurt visits them again. And these obsessive thoughts can serve as a needed distraction from that fear that's sort of out of their control. I mean, the narcissist is going to hurt them, you know, when the narcissist thinks it's well, really convenient for him or her to do so. The survivor doesn't have a whole lot of say about how, you know, if or how that's going to happen. But focusing in on these very upsetting and scary experiences inside kind of can reduce awareness of the fear one is experiencing in relation to the narcissist. And again, what I'm describing right now will be wholly unconscious, but a way that the organism, the survivor's organism, can function to kind of protect oneself as best as is possible. And lastly, the other function is to keep one focused on the defects, again, heavy quotes, of oneself, rather than the narcissist's own real actual sort of defects in their malignant attitudes towards the survivor, their bad intentions towards the survivor, and their sort of psychological frailty, how easily wounded and dangerous that the narcissist is. So if any of these experiences kind of resonate with you, I would highly encourage reading this book about Tormenting Thoughts and Secret Rituals by Ian Osborn. And also, I mean, in short, the treatment approach for OCD, even in this context, is often to sort of try to reduce the power of the intrusive thoughts. And the idea is that the more upset that the person gets at the thoughts, and the more sort of they're regarded as facts, the greater power they tend to have. And similarly, the impetus to engage in the compulsive ritual of trying to neutralize that anxiety grows in kind. So it just becomes this, you know, it's like quicksand. It's like the harder you struggle against it, the further one sinks into it. And so in treatment, the idea is to kind of recontextualize the thoughts or even the disturbing images as just thoughts or images, not as facts, not as edicts about who one is or who one's turning into, and then trying to kind of notice those obsessive thoughts as thoughts without kind of engaging in the again, mental compulsive ritual to neutralize that anxiety. You know, what I said, I think, is a lot easier said than done, because it involves tolerating anxiety and over time too. This is not one and done deal. It often, ongoing support and therapy can be important to address and kind of work to resolve it and or manage it so that it feels much less interruptive in one's life. Well, thank you for tuning in this week. I look forward to posting next week, Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Take good care.